Our last speaker for today is Professor Clara Chow from Westmead Hospital. Professor Chow is an academic director of the Westmead Applied Research Centre of the Faculty of Medicine Health at the University of Sydney. She herself is a clinical cardiologist and initially undertook a PhD at the University of Sydney in the field of cardiovascular epidemiology, and then subsequently was awarded a fellowship to travel to McMaster University, where she was a postdoctoral student in the areas of clinical trial design and cardiac imaging. Her research focuses on prevention of cardiovascular disease, with a particular emphasis on the delivery of innovative digital health care interventions, which, as you are all aware, are very important in today's age. She has expertise also in trial design, delivery, and implementation. Professor Chow is, as I mentioned, a cardiologist at Westmead Hospital. She is also a co-director at the Charles Perkins Centre for at Westmead. Today, she'll talk to us about flexibility and creativity in clinical research. Thank you, Professor Chow.
Thank you, Steve. Can I just have a sound check? Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. I'm actually not going to talk about digital health today, but I could another day. I was trying to ponder how I would approach this, but I hope to tell you a little bit about flexibility and creativity in clinical research and how it has made my career fuller and more interesting as a clinician academic cardiologist. I suppose I'll just start with a very quick career synopsis. I mean, I went to high school in Sydney. I did medical school at the University of Sydney. And I took a year off between my third and fourth year to travel. And in that year, I backpacked around India, China, volunteered in Bangladesh, and also worked in Japan. And probably that year did impact on me. I certainly have amazing memories and experiences from the time that I spent in rural Bangladesh with an Australian nun, of all things, who was also a doctor and worked at or set up a GP centre in the middle of rural Bangladesh. I then went on and did my internship at Westmead Hospital and my basic physician training there, and then my advanced training in cardiology at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. Did my PhD at the George Institute, and I went on to do postdoc years where I went from Glasgow to London to Boston to Hamilton at the Population Health Research Institute in Canada. I am now a clinical academic cardiologist at Westmead Hospital and a professor of medicine at the University of Sydney. And as you said, director of the Westmead Applied Research Centre. So on the weekend, I probably had one of the proudest moments of my research career to date. And that was in presenting the main results of the Quartet randomized clinical trial at the European Society of Cardiology meeting in Paris. Unfortunately, I wasn't in Paris to present this, though gosh, I would have loved to be in Paris to present it. But I did present these trials at the late breaking clinical trial session. And in Australia, it was covered in the news on Channel 9 on Sunday night. And it was nice to see this research also relevant in Australia. So I suppose a couple of the quick things: high blood pressure is the leading cause of cardiovascular disease in the world. The trial questioned the paradigm of how we commonly treat blood pressure now. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the results later, but I thought I would build this talk around the background story of how we came to doing this study. So I mentioned my PhD studies. So my PhD studies was in developing a cardiovascular prevention program suitable for rural India. It was a bit of serendipity, and I'm sure you've heard that word a few times already today. But I recall I actually wanted to work in China, and that is what had attracted me to the George Institute. But the SARS pandemic made it impossible at the time for me to do research in China. And a few weeks after meeting my to-be supervisor, Bruce Neal, I was sent to accompany a team into rural India to look at a potential project in developing a cardiovascular prevention program suitable for this area of rural Andhra Pradesh. It rapidly, however, became clear to us that you can't develop a program of cardiovascular disease prevention for rural Andhra Pradesh without having some understanding of what was going on in rural Andhra Pradesh, and in this case, what was going on with respect to cardiovascular risk factors and their treatment. So the main part of my PhD studies was conducting a large-scale survey across about 45 villages in rural India to survey the levels of cardiovascular risk factors and how they were currently being managed in rural India. Now, the other side of this slide is a picture from the PURE study. So fast forward to my postdoc, and the rather eclectic set of skills I had developed in my PhD in implementing cardiovascular surveys in rural India was seen as valuable by Salim Youssef, one of the leading cardiovascular clinical trialists in the world, who's led some of the amazing trials in thrombolysis that has changed the face of cardiology. But at that time, he was interested in implementing the PURE study, which was a study about understanding the global determinants of cardiovascular disease, and particularly in low and middle income countries. So somehow from rural India and a PhD, I joined this team, the PURE team, and started working in my postdoc across this international study, where I found myself training and talking to people across 17 countries, which was the initial set of countries of PURE, in how to implement cardiovascular surveys in their different parts of the world, how to approach the sampling strategy, how to approach the methods, how to do the surveys, you know, the importance of methodology, etc. So one of the main findings from my PhD was that amongst those at our survey, our cardiovascular risk survey, amongst the people with a high blood pressure at measurement, so blood pressures above 160, only about half of them were aware that they had high blood pressure or aware that they had hypertension. And only about a third were on any form of treatment, the majority being on a single drug, which was a beta blocker. Now, switching again to my postdoc period, one of the main papers I led out of PURE was a study that looked at hypertension awareness, treatment, and control across these 17 countries involved in the PURE study. And this study found, you know, not dissimilar findings in some ways to my PhD, and that is that about half of people with hypertension across, you know, the 17 countries involved in PURE were not aware that they had high blood pressure, while you know, a number of them were on treatment. About 41% were on treatment, most of them on single drug treatment. Only a 13% had controlled blood pressure, and that was, you know, the key finding of this study, but also a study that has now become cited in thousands of papers across the world, including many global health policy papers, WHO papers, and other papers, to raise awareness about the huge gap in understanding of hypertension awareness, or whether people have high blood pressure or not, and the huge gap in control of blood pressure across the world. So look, returning back to Australia was not without its challenges, having, you know, spent, I suppose, about nearly 4 years of my life living overseas, and I suppose working with people and you know, from multiple countries, and traveling a lot to do training and research methods and all this sort of stuff. I came back to Australia to establish myself as a clinical cardiologist here. And I must admit that when I did some of my initial presentations about what I had done in my research to date, I could see that many cardiologists didn't really understand the relevance of the work I had done in international public health to clinical cardiology. But I sent it out as my own, I suppose, personal mission to raise awareness on cardiovascular disease prevention and the importance of clinical leadership on it when I did return. And luckily, I had also learnt while overseas how to do cardiac CT, and that was a useful clinical skill. And I did, set up the first cardiac CT service back here in Australia at Westmead. And we did also initiate some of the first level B courses to train cardiologists in reading cardiac CT. So my first years were about setting up these new clinical services, but still very much passionate about what I had done and what I wanted to do in prevention of cardiovascular disease. Oops. So look, just to recap, blood pressure control is poor globally, and despite the availability of a plethora of blood pressure medicines, and the main barriers to blood pressure control is the need for multiple medicines, and the majority of people around the world are still only on a single drug. And this concept of treatment inertia is that when people start or identified with high blood pressure, they often start on one medicine. But we know the majority of people require at least 2, if not more, medicines to achieve blood pressure control. But often they get lost along the way, and their medicines aren't up titrated. And so really, I suppose that is the barrier to hypertension control, finding a simpler way to achieve this. So I suppose, the underlying thing about Quartet is there a simpler way of achieving blood pressure control? And the quad pill concept, we batted around in, just in those first years after I came back to Australia. And it was about, okay, instead of using a single drug at a full dose, what if we brought together a single pill with 4 drugs, but each of those 4 drugs was a quarter dose? And I suppose the question, why would you do something like that? Well, a quarter dose of a blood pressure drug doesn't give you a quarter of the effect. It actually gives you 60% of the effect. So by bringing 4 quarters together, theoretically, you could get 2.2 times the effect of any single one of those drugs at full dose. And that was our quad pill concept. And that concept we published in the LANCET in 2017. And I reflect on this Twitter feed comment that actually the first grant I got to support the idea here was in 2014, and it was from the Heart Foundation. At any rate, the Quartet trial was about, can a strategy using low-dose single pill combinations overcome the barriers to blood pressure control? And we compared a strategy where we initiated the quad pill compared to the common strategy, which is starting on a single drug of a single type of drug at a full dose and up titrating. And I know that this talk is not about, I suppose, my science, but I suppose the main finding of this Quartet study is that initial treatment with a single pill containing 4 blood pressure lowering agent at a quarter of their usual dose is a safe, quick and effective way of achieving blood pressure control in 80% of patients. And, thinking back to what I showed you at the start from PURE, the blood pressure control across the world, it was achieved in about 13%. And even now, on average is not much better at a worldwide scale. This is really potentially paradigm changing, hopefully, in clinical practice. And it really questions our common paradigm of how we start treatment of hypertension with a single drug and with monotherapy. So I've spent the last week trying to explain Quartet to cardiologists and physicians across Australia and how this should change their clinical practice. But I haven't explained to them how I started thinking about this because of the initial work and my initial interest in international public health, and how that really got me thinking about this problem and how to solve it. So I know this is only meant to be a 15-minute talk, so I hope I have quickly tried to illustrate to you that life as a clinical academic has been fun for me. And I think that thinking flexibly and creatively has really helped me be successful as a clinician researcher. I hope you can see that being flexible about how you approach problems and taking risks now and then is necessary, but also fun. And I hope you can see that while following guidelines in clinical medicine is incredibly important, there is a lot of room for creativity in working out how to change those guidelines and work out how to improve healthcare. So I suppose just, to come back to where I currently am, in 2018, we kicked off the Westmead Applied Research Centre, which was established as a collaboration with Western Sydney Local Health District to address the causes of chronic disease in Western Sydney. And I hope I have and will be able to continue my research in trying to bring that together with impacting patients and populations through this centre. Thank you.